Okay, Bradley, what is your fifth and final tip for us, please?
Okay, fifth and final tip. I've gone for something a bit more generalised as opposed to a specific like wait times or anything. I guess my fifth tip, I think, for all teachers who are interested in becoming more research informed, is to ask yourself, what evidence would I require to change my mind about something? Because we alluded to some of the growth mindset stuff earlier. I was very bullish when I read some of the initial research, and then you read conflicting research. So it doesn't disprove anything, but it just paints a more richer picture. And so it's interesting to think about what evidence would be required to change your mind, because sometimes research, it's very easy, and we all sit here very proudly with ourselves that the profession is much more research engaged. But do we just use it as a way to confirm our initial beliefs? And we add more weight to the studies that kind of cement our previous position, and we find easy ways to discredit studies that don't cement our position. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to consider what would it take to change your mind on a position that you have. And so for example, I think retrieval practice and spacing is probably about as strong a bet as you get when you look at 30 years of research. I don't see that changing anytime soon. But what research would it take for me to change my mind on that? I think it's a healthy conversation, because I think we do have to be quite discerning users with research in terms of asking awkward questions of ourselves. And I think research can give guidelines, but each new study does change how I view stuff. Like, I now view retrieval practice slightly differently to how I did 3 years ago based on some stuff that I've read. And I think that's an interesting discussion around, what would it take to change your mind, either from personal experience with students or from research that you've read.
This is a brilliant one, this. I want to dig into this specifically in a second, Bradley, but I'm just intrigued by that retrieval thing. What was it that you've changed your mind about in terms of retrieval?
Okay, so I guess, so for example, I read one really interesting study that came out about 2 years ago. I only read it last month, around should you give hints during retrieval practice. And what they found is, for example, students love it when you give them hints, and students perceive it to have helped them with their learning more. But actually, when you check how much they've actually learned, those who've been given quite a lot of hints tend to remember less. So you have, again, comes back to that autonomy, to about what you like and what's best for you. And so now I now think about how it's not just enough to do retrieval. Actually, I need to do retrieval that's difficult but still successful. That still probably is followed by feedback. It doesn't have to be, but I think it's better if it is. So it's not just the act of retrieving, though that has benefits. It's more this nuanced approach of how we do retrieval. I'll tell you another example. I used to think, and I still think it's okay, you do retrieval at the end of the lesson based on the lesson that you've taught. But I now kind of think of that more akin to checking for understanding, whereas actually now I think maybe it's better to do retrieval on stuff you did 2 or 3 weeks ago, because I know from a whole bunch of studies, retention rates are really high in the first day. Forgetting curve, right? And you're actually doing quizzing on stuff that I don't expect you to get it all right, but I want to see what's bubbling away. So maybe I do retrieval more on stuff you did 2 weeks ago than opposed to this lesson. So it's not wholesale change. It's not like I was pro and now I'm anti or anything like that. It's more about just the nuance of the application. I think that's what we're kind of improving our understanding of.
Got it. I'll tell you what's interesting for me here, Bradley. So when I first started reading research, I've been teaching for 12 years before I read my first piece of research. And when I read it, I thought, this is amazing, because this has all the answers here. You read a piece of research, it tells you something, and then you go and do it in the classroom and everyone's happy. And then, as we've spoken about earlier on in this conversation, you read something that says either the exact opposite or contradicts what you've said, and so on. Now, I mean, you've probably read 10 times the amount of research that I've read, but I've read a fair bit, but I still don't... But I'll tell you something, I don't know about you here, I still don't think I'm at the point where I can accurately decide whether a piece of research is valid or reliable. Because, like, a classic example of this is, I used to think John Hattie's visible learning and effect size and stuff were kind of the be-all and end-all. I thought, well, this is amazing. This is combining, all the best research studies into one, like a meta-analysis. What could be better than that? Yeah. And then on Ollie Lovell's Education Research Reading Room, they had a whole episode where a guy was just tearing apart Hattie's work on, like, say, meta-analyses are a load of nonsense, and I'm thinking, well, how can I as a teacher get my head around this? And then you've got, sample sizes, significance levels, all this kind of stuff, random controlled trials. So it's real dangerous, isn't it? Because, like, I'm with you. I think retrieval is amazing, but somebody could come along to me and say, look, there's this study that says the worst thing you can ever do is spaced learning. And I'd have to really look hard at that study. And I don't know if I've got the tools to think, is that a valid or reliable study or not? It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things I'd say. So one thing that I'm finding interesting, you mentioned effect sizes, is I now pretty much don't care about effect sizes. I care about effect size kind of relative to the time cost. So if you're doing an intervention that's only 20 minutes from a research paper and it led to a small effect size, well, I'm kind of okay with that. I care a lot more if the effect size is small and it's been a 10-week intensive program. So I think more like the ratio is like an interesting part. I sometimes talk about research papers. I think there's something, I don't even know if this is a thing or if I've just made it up. I like the TripAdvisor effect. Where, like, basically people only go on TripAdvisor to give something 5 stars because they loved it, or 1 star because they hated it. And you see that with research all the time, is this paper's brilliant, 5 stars, it proves my point, or this paper's rubbish, it debunks the whole theory. And that isn't the way to do research, or even understand research. So if you find one paper that essentially gives, for want of a better phrase, spaced learning 1 star on TripAdvisor, for me, that doesn't debunk. I actually hate the word debunk. Like, it doesn't debunk spacing. That study adds to our knowledge of the existing research. And so we kind of talked about in our book, right at the start, we said one study is kind of like a single thread, but taken together, when you zoom out, you can see it as like the whole tapestry. And so I think that's why one study wouldn't change my mind on something. It might raise some questions, but I'd have to see how does that fit in with both all the stuff I've read, but also the stuff I've experienced as well. So I don't think we should discount that either. So I think you can find this balance, and I don't think you need to be, as a teacher, you don't need to be this expert judge on quality of research and where one study proves or disproves. It just helps paint a picture. And now I actually get quite excited when studies show up results that I'm not expecting, because it does make me ask awkward questions of myself and my practice. But I think that's the only way we get better, and we have to get better because it's too important to get wrong. So we shouldn't shy away from these studies. And if retrieval practice works better in some conditions or with some age groups than others, I want to know about that. And I also want to know why. So it's not a case of disproving retrieval practice. It's about, it's interesting that these type of retrieval works better for older students than for primary age students. That's an interesting conversation, and that one as a community we should be having as part of our professional dialogue. So I actually think it's a good thing when I see studies that might suggest stuff like that.
It's fascinating. Just final thing on this. So what interests me, if we take something like Rosenshine's work. Now, Rosenshine, that has been around for decades, years and years and years. And yet it's only in the last kind of 3 or 4 years it went absolutely mental, and it's posters in every school wall and so on. And I think a lot of that was to do with Tom Sherrington writing a really nice, concise, easily accessible book and so on. So for busy teachers out there, Bradley, obviously this curation of research and summaries of it is a really important part of this. But obviously we have that downside that we're then relying on somebody to have taken a representative sample and interpret it right and so on. Do you have either kind of favourite curators who you look to, who you think, this is a good place to at least start, and then is your process then to read the original source, or how do you go about kind of digesting the mountains of research that are out there? Yeah.
So like you, it's been interesting taking Rosenshine as the example. I think the work that Tom has done has been incredible because it's just made it accessible, which I think is a big part. I'm a huge fan. I think it's been incredible for the profession. One thing we wrestle with, because that's basically what we do, is we try and be kind of a Google Translate, because the stuff's behind paywalls or it's written by the psychologists a lot of the time. One thing that generally keeps us up at night and we wrestle with is to make stuff accessible, yet still being true to the original research, because the original research has nuances, and yet everyone wants a neat headline, and sometimes the two. And so the more accessible you make something, do you risk dumbing down or veering from the original research? So finding reliable sources is tricky. I'm a huge fan of, I think the Education Endowment Foundation do brilliant stuff. I'm a huge fan of evidence-based education, Chartered College for Teaching. It'd be remiss not for me not to talk about our Insight Inner Drive. We think we try to do a good job at that. But one thing I think I'm getting more and more interested in is seeing classroom teachers blogging themselves about how they've applied research. So what I'm always interested there is not the actual research itself, it's their interpretation of how it applies to their setting. And that middle bit, that's the interesting part, because it's not up to, it shouldn't be up to teachers to explain the research so much. That's the researcher's job. The teacher's job is working out which stuff is appropriate for my context and trial and error. And sharing that, I think that's a brilliant form of CPD, of hearing how other people are wrestling with the same sort of problems. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about one-off sample size or randomized controlled trials, because I'm not hanging my hat on any one study.
Yeah. So
therefore, if one study is large scale and one study is small, I don't discount the small scale study. It might be really appropriate for that design of that research. And I think it's been really endearing. It's been lovely to actually see the profession over the last 5 years or so, 10 years maybe, really embrace research and translate it and take it their own. And people always worry about lethal mutations. I'm not too worried about lethal mutations, because I think we need that trial and error, and we need that. I wouldn't want anyone to go, this is what they did in the study, so that's what we have to do in my setting, because they are meant to be different. So I kind of like the mutations, because that's how we make informed judgments, I think.
Fascinating.